Hey there guys and gals, Anime Dude here. And after working on my Bakuman video that focused primarily on hard work and the thrill of friendly competition in a creative landscape, I decided to revisit a fun little series that delivers a bit of a different perspective when it comes to pursuing creative endeavors. That series is The Pet Girl of Sakurasou, and while it's listed as a drama/rom-com, I feel like writing it off as only that can be a bit misleading. Don't get me wrong, it totally falls into both of those genres and it does them very well, but for me, that wasn't where the main appeal of the series lied. I know, most of you probably expect me to follow up by saying that the main appeal of the series was its characters. Of course that's what the Anime Dude would say. That's what he always says. It's his default answer. You all think you know me so well, huh? Well, while all the characters were eventually shown to be pretty great, and they were definitely much less generic than we were initially led to believe, I can't bring myself to give them the entirety of the credit. Rather, as shocking as it may be, I think the intricacies of the seemingly generic setting surrounding them helped to put them in a great position, as it allowed for the exploration of various themes and relationships. However, before I talk about that too much, I guess I better clarify a bit of what I meant when I defined the characters as seemingly generic. The show takes place in a school dorm that's filled with eccentric, misfit residents, but the first few episodes don't allow them to display much depth outside of their quirky and wacky behavior. In contrast to that over-the-top cast, the main character is a young man who starts out bored with everyday life. And while that's a pretty common way for many coming-of-age stories to start out, he in particular just doesn't start out the series showing us much more than that. I mean, the only unique thing shown about him is that he's an extreme type of nice guy who's caring enough to take in any stray cat he finds. And why is that important, you may ask? Because similar to those cats of his we just mentioned, the main heroine then moves into the dorm and is pretty much incapable of taking care of herself. I think we've all seen enough harem anime to know where this goes. But just in case you haven't, the main character is of course then placed in charge of taking care of the main heroine. Yes, he's placed in a situation that seems perfect for a rom-com that wants ample opportunity for ecchi moments, and the series makes sure to capitalize on at least some of those chances, but don't click away just yet and hear me out. While that situation may initially seem like it's just some plot contrivance used to generate potentially pervy moments, it forces him and the audience to wonder if caring for this girl is really supposed to be the solution for the void he feels in his life. Before we talk about that though, let me just say that the rest of the cast is great and lovable. There's no doubt about that, and there's definitely a ton of depth within each and every one of them, besides maybe the hot teacher, but I'm not gonna complain cause hey, hot teacher. But my point is that despite how great and lovable these characters end up being, it's not necessarily clear right from the get-go. Expectation subversion is a great literary tool, and while I don't think this show is necessarily trying to fool anyone by masquerading as a pure romantic comedy or anything like that, it doesn't make the route they end up going down any less surprising. To clarify, that's not to say that there is some kind of surprise that'll ruin the show for you if you know it. It's just the fact that this show ended up being so much more than one would initially expect, and that was a surprise in and of itself. This brings me back to what I initially wanted to gush about, and while I guess it kinda goes hand in hand with me gushing about the characters, I just want to talk about how the relationships between those characters are explored as a result of the setting. I'm going to do my utmost to not give away too much, but like I said, although this show subverts initial expectations, I don't think it's necessarily trying to fool its audience by any means. So, while what I say will hopefully convince you to watch the show, I don't see it having any sort of negative impact on your potential enjoyment of it. Anyways, this setting is one that takes a main character who has nothing inherently interesting about him and is by all means ordinary, and it places him in an environment where he's surrounded by extremely talented people. I'm not going to go too much into what the other characters do, but the cast as a whole contains characters with talent in animating, voice acting, writing, programming, and art. These are all creative endeavors, and while it's neat for a series like Bakuman to explore aspects of creation through a single outlet, the myriad of talent here forces us to realize that none of these things I just listed off are necessarily that different from one another at their core. They're all creative endeavors, and the approach to any one in particular isn't necessarily that different from the others. It just depends on where your passions and talent lie, and what you want to dedicate yourself to creating. Now there's a couple different directions I could go here, but let me start out by clarifying and expanding upon something I said earlier. I said that the main character starts out the series with nothing in particular going for him, and he just seems bored with everyday life like a lot of protagonists are at the start of most coming-of-age stories. However, the first line of this show, spoken by the protagonist himself, is, "Every day was the same. Deep down, I felt bored. I wanted to blame someone for my being bored." While this does indeed initially seem like the standard coming-of-age tale, there's a subtlety here that implies so much more. While the main character is just an average person, and that alone will make him at least a little bit relatable to a majority of this show's audience, the last bit of that quote is what really hits home. He wants someone to blame for his being bored. Now I don't know about you, but something I've personally noticed throughout my life thus far is that there's two types of people. Those who make excuses and those who get things done. Those who always hold themselves accountable and those that always find something to blame. Now which category you fit into is subject to change because after all, we're all constantly changing throughout life. However, this subtle difference between people tends to lead to a not so subtle difference when determining how successful they become. While the definition of success is subjective in and of itself, accountability is something that factors into everyone's own individual metrics of success, as well as whether or not they're able to achieve it according to those personal metrics. You know what? Maybe I underplayed the importance of the expectation subversion that we discussed earlier. While I don't think the impact of it makes too much of a difference narratively speaking, the main character arguably starts out as a bit of a self-insert. You know, normal relatable guy, now living with a cute girl who he has to help get dressed and whatnot, seems like a typical rom-com ecchi harem character insert in more ways than one. But that's only initially, and the environment he's put into is one that forces him to take a good hard look at himself and what he truly wants. Sure, he's living with and taking care of a cute girl that he's starting to like, but despite what we're initially led to believe, that's not the cure for the boredom that he expressed at the start of the series. Far from it. In fact, looking at himself critically and comparing what he sees to the amazingly talented people around him makes him feel as if he doesn't belong. However, born from that self-doubt is a yearning. He might have his doubts on whether or not he actually belongs, but he wants to. With that being said, it's only when he starts to hold himself accountable for his own happiness and ambitiously pursue his own creative endeavors that the series really begins. After all, as fun as the creative process can be, it's filled with various challenges and hurdles. It's simply human nature to compare you and your work to others, and while the fact that he's surrounded by so many talented people can be very beneficial at times, it's also just asking to have your confidence shattered. Feelings of inferiority can bring out some of the ugliest parts of humanity: jealousy, frustration, and even resentment. Being in such close proximity with one another forces confrontation when these emotions begin to well up, and while this really helps to drive home the more dramatic moments of the series, the drama doesn't really feel cheap or forced. How to say it? While there's a lot of shows out there that tend to rely on over-exaggerated melodrama, there's something about the way that this series handles character confrontations that just really hits home. It builds up gradually and organically beforehand, and while you hate to actually see it unfold, there's a part of you that understands it, that sympathizes with it. It's not just the characters being overly dramatic, there's a purpose to it. I genuinely believe that to succeed in life, you first have to learn what it means to fail. The main character's feelings of inferiority bring forth a myriad of themes and questions that encapsulate what it means to experience failure, all while simultaneously characterizing the people around him. Perhaps that's why it's so relatable, because everybody has experienced failure at one point or another, and if they haven't, then that simply means they haven't really tried anything that's worth doing. While the rest of the cast may be talented and eccentric, they're still people going through internal struggles of their own. And the fact that there's so much more than just complementary pieces for the main character is a huge part of what makes this series work. If you can't really relate to the protagonist, then odds are there will at least be one other character that you'll be able to relate to or grow attached to, as they each undergo their own individual character arcs as well. While I don't find there to be too much that's inherently interesting about the main character by himself, I truly find it fascinating to watch the environment and people around him have such a profound effect on him and how he approaches life, as well as how his presence affects them in turn. So I guess at the end of the day, even when I tried not to spend a ton of time gushing about the characters, I ended up doing just that. After all, whether you grow fond of them or not will more than likely determine whether or not you'll enjoy the series. With that being said, I'm going to try not to talk too much about any of the other characters, that way you can gradually get to know them better for yourselves throughout the show. I actually haven't read the light novels from which this series was based on yet, but I have revisited this show on multiple occasions. As such, I'm pretty confident that anyone who enjoys rom-coms will more than likely love this series, and anyone who doesn't normally enjoy rom-coms may still find something that's surprisingly enjoyable about it. I'm well aware that this series seems generic at first glance, and although it's pretty great, it doesn't really seem like anything special from the outside looking in. Likewise, I feel it's a show that many people end up glossing over without ever giving it a chance. I mean, I know I'm repeating myself quite a bit, but I can't even begin to emphasize how much of a hidden gem this series is, so I can only hope I was able to convince you to give it a try. If it still doesn't quite seem like it's the show for you, then feel free to check out some of my other Why You Should Watch videos as well. If you don't think you'd enjoy any of the other shows I've recommended to date, well then, I guess we'll have to go with Plan C. Huge thank you to everybody that supports me over on Patreon. If you'd like to join the Patreon crew and have your name appear at the end of videos like this, then I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. With it, I'll also leave links to all my social media, so between that and the comment section down below, feel free to let me know how you like the pet gorilla Sakurasou and what you'd like to see me cover next. Thank you all for watching, and Anime Dude out.